What is up, everybody? Welcome to another edition of the Weekend Roundup here on Touchline Talk. Thank you so much for tuning in. As always, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of the content going up on the channel. Two main topics I want to cover today, and then a little bit on the Madrid derby as well. Starting with Manchester City's draw against Newcastle. It was a industrious performance from Newcastle, kind of Eddie Howe's team at its very best in terms of what it looks like when Newcastle are really playing to their capability. Definitely deserved a point in this game. I want to talk more about the ramifications part of this, though. Obviously, Manchester City's first game without Rodri, since it was announced he's going to miss the rest of the season with the injury. And the bottom line here is very simple. We don't know whether any player at Manchester City is actually irreplaceable or not. The only one that can really test that is Rodri. Now, you can make an argument Erling Haaland this season because Julian Alvarez is no longer there. I would still argue, though, that between Doku, Foden, De Bruyne, Grealish, Silva, Savinho, you get the point. Even if they have to readjust things and play with a false nine, they got more than enough attacking talent that even Haaland is replaceable. What they don't have is somebody who can do what Rodri does, because there's not another player in the world who can do what Rodri does. There's not another player who can do what Rodri does in that system, and he is a large part of why it works so well. The fact that they could go from Fernandinho to Rodri in that role. It is not a coincidence. This has happened too often where they have struggled without Rodri. They did not lose a Premier League game last season in which Rodri played. It's not the only reason they have drawn or lost when he's not been on the field, but there is a clear connection between when they drop points and specifically when they lose and Rodri's availability. Now, correlation doesn't equal causation, but this is a huge deal. And oh, by the way, now, as I've been saying, it is Liverpool at the top of the table, and Arsenal are right back in this, because it was always premature to declare this thing over when Arsenal were able to beat Spurs, and then Arsenal went to the Etihad and got a point. I get tired of people just handing this to Manchester City. Look, are they still the favorites? Yeah, probably. Even without Rodri. But look at what we were talking about and what the situation was 2 weeks ago, and look at where we are now. You have got to let this thing play out and not jump to conclusions. It really, really frustrates me, and this is why. We don't know what's going to happen. But the bigger point here, and the thing I want to focus on, is we are going to find out if somebody at Manchester City is truly irreplaceable or not. Because you have a lot of things going against Manchester City right now. Arsenal getting 2 late goals to avoid a very confusing and disappointing draw against Leicester at home. Liverpool survive and pick up 3 points. Now City are kind of trying to keep pace and now playing Liverpool from behind, which I've always said is a key to being able to beat them. You got to get an advantage, and now Liverpool and Arsenal are in a position to do that. That position that Rodri plays, I still believe, is just criminally underrated generally. And even in Manchester City, nobody else can do what he can do. So we're going to find out. Because if they regroup, they go on to win this title, then anybody at that club is replaceable. But we've never been tested in this way before. Now we're going to find out just how valuable he is and just how good Manchester City are without him. Speaking of value, by the way, the other thing I do want to mention before we get to Manchester United and Erik ten Hag, there is a real strong argument that Cole Palmer is the single most valuable player in the Premier League. If you were awarding an MVP, right now he would have my vote. And Rodri may have it by the end of the season, depending on how this goes, for the reasons I just talked about. But that was an absolutely ridiculous performance by Cole Palmer. He is tied with Erling Haaland for the most goal involvements. He leads the Premier League in goal involvements per 90 minutes. He is not just converting a bunch of penalties. That was part of the story last year and needs to be acknowledged. He is spectacular and is making it almost impossible for whoever the next England manager is to keep him on the bench or to not use him consistently. I don't know how you can look at what he's doing and say he's not in your starting 11 for England, no matter who else is there. Just wanted to throw that out there too, because that was something special he did over the weekend. Now to Manchester United and Erik ten Hag. It's a very dispiriting loss to Spurs at home. Spurs jump on them from minute one, just carve that midfield to shreds, get chance after chance after chance. Was it a tough red on Bruno? Yeah, probably. Was it a clear and obvious error? No. Which goes back to how are we framing this conversation, and can the Premier League and its referees be consistent with this? If you take away the fact that it was originally called the red, it's probably a yellow. But is there justification for keeping the red when the bar to overturn it is a clear and obvious error? Absolutely. And yes, he was slipping, but he also moved his foot up and got really, really high into James Maddison's leg. That's enough justification for a red if that's the call on the field. I have no issue with that. The initial call is questionable. To me, this is not a VAR issue. If we're going to have a high bar, this is United got a little bit unlucky because, admittedly, that looks a lot worse than it actually was. And that's the unfortunate part for Bruno Fernandes. But this game was not about that. And United even played better after he got sent off for the most part. We're 2+ years into this with Erik ten Hag. First, it was, well, he needs time to implement his vision, to get this United team to start looking more like his Ajax team, to bring in some players. Totally valid. And then it became clear this was never going to be the same as his Ajax teams. There has been very little, if any, evolution or progression in terms of style of play, in terms of overall performance, in terms of what this looks like. And I made this point at the end of last season when I also said your decision should not be based on one game, whether you're keeping your manager or not. If you were going to fire him before the FA Cup final, you should have fired him after it. This is why. And also, the question is, are you okay with this being what you are as Manchester United? It's going to look good sometimes. They'll be able to play with some of the big teams and pull some upsets like that FA Cup final because they're transition-based. They're going to be infuriating for the fan base from game to game. And they're generally not going to be that good. They're going to be underwhelming. So by deciding to keep ten Hag, Ineos was communicating they're okay with Manchester United being this. It's been too long to believe something is going to change. At the end of last season, the next explanation for the underachievement was all of the injuries defensively, which, again, valid. Johnny Evans and Harry Maguire were out there at center back sometimes. Of course, he had nothing close to his first choice defensive foursome, and he was throwing back different center back partnerships left and right out of necessity. Okay. So if you want to say that's why things looked like the way they did last season, fine. There's validity to that. So what happened this summer? They go out They acquire another center forward. They go get their replacement for Casemiro at the number 6 position. They go buy not one, but two of Ten Hag's former defenders. And all four of those players were in the starting lineup for this game against Spurs when they got cut open from basically the first minute of the game. And when Mickey Van de Ven just dribbled the ball 75 yards to set up a goal. So what's the explanation now? This is the problem Erik Ten Hag has. Because everything he has pointed to and all of the, right, this conversation about kind of excuses versus explanations, all of the external circumstances that he didn't really have control over are gone. What else does he have to point to? His center back pairing was Matthias de Ligt and Lisandro Martinez. And it still looked the same. They were still really easy to play against. They're still almost exclusively transition based. I did come on here and say that the season opener against Fulham, they actually looked like they could break teams down, so that was promising. And then I said, that's one game though. Let's see if this actually stays, because I've learned my lesson not to believe that that's actually what it's going to look like. And here we are again. It doesn't mean it's Ten Hag's fault. I don't want to get into a whole conversation until a managerial change is ultimately going to be made, because maybe they decide to stick it out with him. But I saw after the game he was saying that he needs time. And, I mean, that's basically all he has to point to now. But how much time are we talking about? And if we're talking about time, the other problem he has is you got to show some kind of progress. You got to show like there's a plan, show that there's a plan in place to make this better. They're the exact same team doing the exact same thing, even though the players have changed, and I would argue generally have gotten better. I know, okay, Ugarte still got to settle in. Maybe this gets a little bit better over time. But we've seen this story too many times. This is who United are under Erik Ten Hag. And this is generally who United are until somebody is able to come in and actually fundamentally change the culture of the club. That could be Ineos, that could be a manager. But it clearly hasn't happened yet. And so the question is still the same from a should they fire him standpoint. Are you okay with this? If the answer is no now, then why wasn't it the same answer back in May before the FA Cup final? But that's all I'm going to say about the firing part. We'll see kind of where things go from here. Finally, Madrid derby. A putrid first half. Maybe that's putting it nicely. Ultimately turns into a very intense, dramatic, ugly game. Players have to leave the field after stuff was thrown, looked mostly like lighters at Thibaut Courtois by the Athletic Ultras. You had some of the longtime players on the club, Diego Simeone, going over there trying to get them to at least calm down. La Liga should come down incredibly hard on Atleti for this. The fact that some of these people were wearing masks, and it seems like there was a social media push to wear masks, that this was something intentional to avoid being caught. That is, of course, pathetic. But also, Atleti needs to take this head on. La Liga needs to take this head on. It's ridiculous. It's disgraceful. It needs to stop. The game itself, there's not too much to get into here. That was obviously the storyline, as you're waiting to see how this thing is going to unfold and whether they could actually finish the game. It is Atleti who get the late equalizer on a weekend where Barcelona also lose. And the one thing I'll say is, Simeone's going to take his criticism all the time for his team not coming out and playing. Looked like they might based on the lineup. They certainly did not, at least until they needed to score a goal. Ultimately, Real Madrid did take the lead. I am firmly of the belief, though. I will go to bat for Atleti for a little bit in this sense. If this Real Madrid team is as good as everybody says they are, it is on them to go out and win this game. It is not Atleti's job to go out and win this game. It is always the team with the more money, more talent, their responsibility to go take the game to the other team. And yeah, Atleti makes your life miserable. They're masters of the dark arts. This is what it takes to go win a league title. Real Madrid have struggled to do that. It is a completely different skill set than it is in the Champions League. I don't want to harp over all of that again, but just pointing out that once again, for a minute there, it looked like Real Madrid were going to come away with a really big win on a weekend where Barcelona lost, and that they were going to be right feeling good about where they are in La Liga. And I was going to have to give them some credit. And ultimately, they give up the goal. It's not a bad result. It's not the end of the world. But Barcelona are still in control of this league. And I'm just going to keep hammering that point home, because if that doesn't change in the next month or two, either that says a lot about Barcelona or it says a lot about Real Madrid. It's got to be one of the two, and I keep making this point. But as they drop more points against their crosstown rivals, wanted to bring it up again. The main story, though, the nonsense with the Atleti fans, and I will reinforce one more time, the only way this stuff, the racism, all of this stuff is going to stop in Spain. And I'm just talking Spain specifically because they've kind of been at the center of most of this in the past couple years. Is for somebody, and multiple people, to be precise, from the clubs, from La Liga, from UEFA, to step up and say enough is enough. That did not happen when there were all of the conversations initiated by Vinicius and the abuse that he went through, and people were trying to defend it and all of this kind of, and just saying weird things that didn't make sense, or trying to excuse it in some way, and trying to downplay it and say it wasn't really racist or whatever, or that people don't understand the culture. Same thing here. Obviously a different context, but it needs to stop. And if it happens again, Atleti should have to forfeit the game. Fans should not be allowed to delay a game by throwing things on the field at their former goalkeeper. I feel like that's something we can pretty much all agree on. That is all for the weekend roundup. Thank you so much for tuning in. As always, be sure to hit that subscribe button. I'll see you next time.